Hi everyone, it's July 23rd, and we're back with another production from the Ugly Duckling's Alchemical Theatre. In this part 4, we're going to discuss Pardes, the garden, as it applies to different levels of reading, the dawning of self-consciousness through mistakes, and the circle dance, which will help us correct some of those mistakes. Finally, we will touch on the Alchemical Theatre itself, the Mundus Imaginalis, and the stage. Pardes is an acronym for exploring deeper layers of reading. Peshat, the first letter, Pe, represents historical surface meanings of the text. Remez is allegorical, suggesting hidden meaning, symbols, allusions, the gematria that we use with the numbers. Dirash is homiletical, implies moral lessons, parables, and rulings. And finally, Sod implies a secret or mystical, esoteric, what transcends rational comprehension. From the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism, we hear that allegory clothed alchemical theories were the course of the work in a story which was understood as a simile or parable. Allegory clothes alchemical theories. And from Tolkien, in his On Fairy Stories, he tells us history often resembles myth because they are both ultimately of the same stuff. Here we revert to our intro picture of the three psychic knots, and as we can see in this picture here, in the two on the left, the two lines pointing to the skeleton in red, we're moving up from the previous one that represented Mars, the card of the tower, up to the card of strength, which shows a woman leading a lion. Here, if we notice carefully, is pointing to the ribs on this skeleton. And these particular ribs look a little strange, a little out of place. I welcome you to look at it. It represents the Jupiter and heart center, power, possessions, and fame. Our first psychic knot was vital drives, fears, survival instincts. I'm not quite sure that we've resolved the first knot, but it's time to start working on the second knot. It may just be that they're working simultaneously. The second knot represents Jupiter and the heart. Again, power, possessions, and fame. The third knot we're not quite ready to approach yet, although parts of it may reveal itself to us as we move along. As I had previously mentioned, the three psychic knots are also related to the three temptations of Jesus, which are listed here below if one is interested in looking at them. The first mistake that I want to bring out was in my previous presentation. I mentioned that the Earth cube was made up of 24 scalene triangles. That was a fairly major Freudian slip. I meant isosceles right angle triangles, but I said scalene. And it provided me an opportunity to come back and correct the mistake by pointing out that I meant 24 isosceles right angle triangles, which are represented by 45 degrees, 45 degrees, and 90 degrees for their three angles. On the far lower right, you see a representation of it. It's interesting to me that that mistake occurred. I don't understand why, but it wasn't just a simple Freudian slip. It was actually put into the text itself. I wrote scalene triangles when I actually meant isosceles. And so it gives me this opportunity to revisit. And in revisiting, I found out something even more interesting. As I mentioned before, fire, air, and water, the scalene triangles, Plato argued could break down and morph into one another. In modern science, we know that gas, liquid, and plasma can change phases. Now, what's even more interesting is that Plato said that isosceles triangles continue to form squares and he argued that they could never transform into fire, air, or water, as its building blocks do not fit together. And this might be exactly why I hesitated or why the mistake occurred. As I said, I don't know why the mistakes occurred. Let's get back to Empedocles, who we mentioned previously. And as I said before, he represented the four elements, the four roots, as living cosmic deities. And one of the interesting things that I'm allowed to bring up now is that he believed that the elements combine from physical things to form bone, blood, and flesh. Bone, interestingly enough, he gave a recipe for. Is found in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Bone was 2 parts earth, 2 parts water, and 4 parts fire. These kinds of things still blow my mind. I have no idea how these little triangles were formed to form that. But it's an interesting proposition and part of what was and continues to be a part of our hidden tradition. Now, he had also mentioned that love, philia, was unity, and strife, nikos, division, and that these two forces seem to be, how would I call it, energizing, empowering the dance and play of the four elements. As I pointed out before, Plato took these poetic descriptions and chemical recipes and gave them geometric forms. They became for him lines, angles, and triangles. Mistakes in Kabbalah, I've come to find out, are sometimes hidden blessings. And maybe one of the things that led to my mistake was, I said, a resistance to this inability of the isosceles triangles to be blended with the others that Plato so aptly described. And it made me think about my encounter with Shel Silverstein's The Missing Piece Meets the Big O many years ago. It's this little story about a triangle, an incomplete fragment that tries to find a fit. And he tries many different incomplete structures, but the fit quite didn't work out. When he finally found one that worked out, he then started to grow and no longer fit. It's a fascinating little, simple, but amazing story about how a little triangle discovers that by wearing down its sharp edges through rolling, galgal in Hebrew, does it, cease, does it cease to be a piece and become a small, big O, a self-contained, rolling circle that moves under its own internal center of gravity. Now, to be fair, it's actually fairly incredible that just recently, um, 2020, as a matter of fact, Plato's claim that the earth is made of cubes had been dismissed as pure mysticism. And yet, a recent publication claims that Plato's cube is actually a natural geometric fragmentation here on Earth. The study applies mathematical theory of convex mosaics to natural rock fragmentation and demonstrates that when three-dimensional space fractures randomly, the geometric properties of the resulting shards statistically average out to a topological cube. Below, I've given the reference for that. I am a little bit, how would I call it? I'm a little bit skeptical of mathematical theories, although they're very useful. But things change over time. But in any event, this was rather fascinating to think that there is a mathematical theory of things breaking down, and when you try to put the pieces back together again, it ends up being a topological cube, suggesting that Plato may have had some level of insight into these Earth triangles forming cubes. Another interesting theory, and this one I'm just going to point out how in science things tend to balance themselves out. Sometimes they support theories, and sometimes they reject theories, and a lot of it tends to be on the perspectives that we're taking. We talked about perspectives in the previous talk. Here we see that ether, what we had called the quintessence of the fifth element, the fabric of space itself. In 2003, there was a theory called Poincare dodecahedral space, which actually claimed it was a hypothesis that the ether or the universe itself was, how would I call it, rounded itself out. Unfortunately, the Poincare dodecahedral space hypothesis, though not disproved, mathematically it's a very elegant formula. It failed because the Planck satellite showed the universe isn't positively curved like a dodecahedron, which they had proposed. What's interesting to me is going back to Plato's Timaeus. In fact, here I'm actually quoting Cornford, who's an expert on Plato. Plato claims that physics is inherently incapable of becoming an exact science because its physical subject, matter, is basically unstable, fluctuating, and chaotic. Hmm. Something to consider. In any event, I'm not trying to convince us of anything. I'm just pointing out mistakes which are very relevant in our own personal development. And here I want to point out some things in our own personal development. I call this building holy vessels. Earlier I talked about how we need to inform our subtle bodies. And I'm not so certain that that's correct. I think our subtle bodies are already there. We just need to hook in to through our conscious awareness. But what I wanted to point out is that some of the techniques that we actually use, meditation, breathing, actually lead to neuroplasticity and somatic changes. The human brain is a very complex, living, transceiving organ. Unrectified, it is locked into its survival patterns, ego defense mechanisms, and the linear constraints of time and space. Metaphysics, I will argue, is biophysical, and biophysics is spiritual. Breath can anchor the nervous system, and by that I mean support it. And meditation and contemplation on geometric patterns and symbolic images like tarot all help to effect changes in our physical as well as psychical organisms. It shifts brain into deep coherence, alters the neurology, deep contemplation, rhythmic breathing, precise sonic frequencies, the bata drums. They modify the neural architecture of the brain, tempering the biological organ in the crown in the world of action, the physical realm. Helps achieve transparency so that we may eventually become aware of the Mundus Imaginalis. Here's evidence from functional magnetic resonance imaging. The meditation, excuse me, alters baseline physiology, the functional activity, and brain mass. Yes, parts of the brain become larger and some actually become smaller through meditation. In particular, areas like the prefrontal cortex, there's cortical thickening, the hippocampus is increased, the amygdala is responsible for fight or fight is decreased. But I must admit, this is in long-term practitioners. This is not seen in those who just happen to pick up meditation or breathing techniques over the short term. Short-term interventions do alter fleeting brainwave frequencies. They reshape neurology, takes years of dedication, if meditative dedication. It is not a matter of a couple of months, although it does have beneficial effects. Now, having said that, there are also adverse effects, which we can read here down at the bottom of the slide, due to meditational techniques. And in this particular study that I've cited here, they looked at focus attention meditation, and they found that the majority of adverse techniques were associated with it, but that all three meditational techniques that they looked at had to do with ego dissolution, all had adverse effects. Now, when we engage in an esoteric study, especially when done in a group or a school, you're probably warned early on. It seems that meditation increases the, how would I call it, increases the speed in which we encounter karmic events that need to be resolved so that we can grow within our spiritual finding. Having said that, they're not necessarily pleasant. And if we're doing it on our own, it can be very, how would I call it, disorienting. And thus, it's necessary to be clear that these techniques are helpful, but only when we're ready to handle them. And so that's why it's important that either we're being guided or that we pay close attention to our own guidance when we encounter or when we engage some of these techniques, and that we pace it, because time is of the essence in our esoteric work. Here I entitled this Mind and Matter. Not mind over matter, not mind or matter, but mind and matter. We may come out to find out that they're not very different. It's only a matter of perspective, a matter of where we are in our own understanding. But what's interesting here is that this scientific study in the middle of the slide is called Effect of Rosary, Prayer, and Yoga Mantras on Autonomic Cardiovascular Rhythms, Comparative Study. What's fascinating is, and this is fairly dated, it's from 2001, and I cited it in the previous paper that I showed, that resonant, coherent breathing or rhythmic prayer, like the rosary, leads to salubrious or beneficial effects. And these are physical effects that they're looking at. The specific frequency engages the heart, lungs, and brainstem into a unified electrical loop, sending a surge down the vagus nerve that reduces inflammation, drives internal clearing, and calms an erratic heart rate. In the particular study that Bernardi and others looked at, they looked at the repetitive rhythmic spiritual practice, praying the Latin. It must be clear. It must be clear. This is the Latin rosary, or reciting the yoga mantra Om Mani Padme Om. Now, they don't really go into the state of being of the individual. Were they aware of the spiritual significance? Was there a religious background behind it? Although I must admit, the study was done on nuns. For the yoga mantras, I don't recall. But the state of mind is very important, and we may actually perceive that a little bit as we move on. But I would argue it's not simply the repeating the words without any effect or without any conscious attention to their meaning. But having said that, the investigators don't really go into that, as it was a scientific study. But what they found was that the natural phrasing of both the Latin rosary and the mantra changed participants' respiration to slow it down to almost 6 breaths per minute. And they discovered that they had salubrious effects. I don't go into that here because it's too complicated, but they looked at various things, both functional, physiological, as well as cardiovascular physical changes. These are references supporting um, the various things I've pointed out in this previous two slides. This is another series of references, again, supporting this. I won't go into this in any detail. I just wanted to show that there is a lot of scientific data out there. Now here we're back to the alchemy of intentional fermentation. I brought that up uh, in the previous discussion. And I mentioned how the vile materials are recognized as the most sacred spirit. And fermentation tends to be, ironically enough, one of our earliest processes on earth. And it's incredibly significant, not only in baking bread, um, but in our own biological system, not only in the gut, but in the muscles. It is an incredibly significant process that, admittedly, though working in science for many years, I had never really considered it into detail. So, Jesus' parable of the leaven discusses a slow internal cooking, which is fermentation. Fermentation is the dead matter, the vegetable phase, broken down by heat and microorganisms to release the spirit. The underworld of the body, the gut, intestines, and the pelvic bowl. Fermentation, alchemically, is our inner fire to digest our experiences. Here I point out that if we don't ferment by facing those discarded parts of ourselves, we'll remain unleavened, a flat bread. So in Jesus' parable, the woman hides 3 measures of leaven in the flour. Mystical truth is revealed through its concealment, according to Elliot Wolfson in Liminal Darkness. You cannot see the yeast working in the dark interior of the dough until the bread rises. Divine energy is dark, hidden to our eyes, yet it is what animates reality. Origen and Augustine viewed this parable of the 3 measures as parts of our body that need to be transformed. The spirit, the pneuma, is a human consciousness with its divine connection. The soul, the psyche, was a seat of emotion, intellect, and will. And the body, the soma, the physical biological vessel, the clay, literally our gut. Alchemically, Mercury, spiritus, key 1 of Tarot, represents the psychic rift. When Mercury is volatile and ungrounded, it represents the bridge between heaven and earth. But when it's severed, it leads to dysbiosis. Sulfur, key 4, represents the respiratory diaphragm, seat of the soul's desires and emotions. It ventilates the digestive fire, calor innatus, driving the fermentation of life. When it's in a healthy state, under toxic stress, the alchemy leads to combustion, the suffocating, foul smoke, foul odors, dark, Gothic vapors surge, leads to increased H2S and dysbiosis. The salt body, key 13, key 21. Key 13 is death, represents putrefaction. Key 21 is Saturn. They represent our pelvic floor and the sacrum. Under chronic trauma, the salt remains unrectified, leads to coagulation in disease states. The spagyric art requires solve and coagulate to dissolve and to coagulate. Key 4 of Tarot represents calcination. The rigid locked pelvic floor, the levator ani, and the sacrum are resolved through analysis. Key 11, Justice, represents sublimation. Deep rhythmic breathing forces the locked respiratory diaphragm downward. This mechanical action releases the stagnant toxic H2S vapors from the gut, restoring the natural, clean microbial fermentation. Key 9, Virgo, represents distillation. As the lower diaphragm begins to pump in unison again, the lymphatic system, the cerebrospinal fluid, the liquid mercury, circulates freely. The fermentation byproducts stimulate enteroendocrine cells in the gut lining. These cells fire electrical signals directly up to the vagus nerve, to the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, triggering synthesis and release of oxytocin. Underneath, we find the relevant references for these particular claims. Mesmerized. I love this picture on the right. Animal magnetism. Franz Mesmer wrote his PhD thesis, or the doctoral thesis, on the influence of the planets on the human body, De Planetarium Influxum Corpus Humanum, back in 1766. He popularized a very old and traditional practice of magnetic medicine. Athanasius Kircher had already written about it 100 years, 150 years beforehand, Paracelsus even earlier than that. And Franz Mesmer learned his practice from a Jesuit astronomer, Maximilian Hell. He learned first with using steel magnets, and eventually Mesmer recognized that using his hands might have been more efficient, and he termed it animal magnetism. Although, of course, as I said, he wasn't the first. Athanasius Kircher had already done that. Laying on of hands has been and continues to be a global practice. Mesmer's belief was the blood was the primary carrier of a universal magnetic fluid. In 1784, under accusations that the practices were involving sexual magic, a royal commission was set up in France to investigate these practices. And ironically enough, Benjamin Franklin was a part of it, and a fairly renowned scientist at the time, Lavoisier. He was very significant in the discovery of what we today call oxygen. And the commission's results were that the effects were real, but caused entirely by imagination, what we today call the placebo effect. What's interesting is that I would have been fascinated by that, but there was no recognition of the imagination as a healing power. The use of the term imagination in this case was to imply that it was fake, empty, and fraudulent. Yet what's fascinating is that the imagination had effects. But these results were swept under the carpet, one can say. Today, we recognize the placebo effect, the positive expectations lead to improvements, though the treatment itself may be inactive. Happens in about 30% of the cases from my experience from working on that field. Nocebo is actually the opposite, that negative expectations can result in adverse outcomes, pain, nausea, or other unpleasant symptoms. So faith or belief is associated with healing, and fear or anxiety with illness. In fact, it is well established that reading about potential side effects makes the patient more likely to experience the side effects. Are there advancements in 1784? Yes, but no clear answers yet. Intriguingly, today there's a science link between animals and iron-based magnetism called magnetite, or an iron oxide. It's actually an internal compass found in birds and many other animals, and even in humans, and aligns with the Earth's magnetic field. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allows us to see the growths in the brain that I mentioned earlier, measures the magnetic shift in blood as oxygen levels flux. Oxygenated blood is diamagnetic, weakly repelled by magnets. Deoxygenated blood is paramagnetic, is weakly attracted. Today, we even use pulse and electromagnetic field therapies that actively influence the diaphragm via or by way of the blood mitochondrial function and microcirculation. Animal magnetism was right. Iron in the blood is vital to life and may be due to the mitochondria. These are book references for the topics just discussed. Nick Lane's Power, Sex, Suicide, Mitochondria, and the Meaning of Life, I found incredibly enjoyable read. But all the rest I recognize are a little bit dated, but they're significant. Corbin I threw in there as a totally different perspective um, on this process, not as scientific, but we're involving the same. It's the same spiritual science. Here are the scientific references for the claims just made. These are actually papers and not books. And this was what one can call a synchronicity or a God made coincidence, which is my preferred choice of words. It's a publication that came out in somewhere in 2025, I think towards the end of the year. There were actually two publications by uh, this primary author and his associates, Laivaditis, and they beautifully argue that modern medicine replaced the historical concept of pneuma with cardiopulmonary bypass. This is a device that allows us, in any event, this is their claim. And their claim is that the concept of pneuma, which is what the Greek word for what St. Paul called spirit or the Holy Spirit, is basically an unscientific misunderstanding of oxygenation and blood circulation. And that's their opinion, and be that as it may, um, they basically I must admit the paper was very well done, and they do a very nice historical evolution of the way of thinking from the ancients who were more integrated with spirit and soul than we are today, and in their consciousness. And he goes on to show how this eventually, or they go on to show how this eventually leads to, with today, more sophisticated scientific understanding. Um, they focus mostly as the heart being a pump and the lungs being gas exchangers. And I want to keep it there. I don't necessarily want to take it to a spiritual level um, and redefining Noema, but just emphasize that reevaluating the evolution of Pneuma through the mitochondrial quantum biology leads us to a different understanding that is provided by these authors like Vaditis and others. Um, they basically mention breathing oxygenates the body, and that's in a sense true. But what I wanted to point out is the respiration happens inside the cell, in and by the mitochondria and its electron transport system. It uses iron and copper atoms to generate cellular energy, which is ATP, and CO2 and H2O, water. The mitochondrial respiration requires quantum tunneling, which allows electrons to teleport between the iron and cytochrome C and the copper atoms of the electron transport system. Lee in 2019, sorry, the different languages want to jump out at the same time here, showed it's a beautiful visualization of the real-time quantum biological electron tunneling. Everyone expected it, but no one knew how it worked. And they were actually able to visualize this. This is fascinating. And what I want to emphasize here is that science didn't eliminate animating spark. It identified its quantum mechanics, which is, to be honest, very, very recent and still relatively mind blowing, at least in my case. But it's wanted to show how what we look at, what one level may appear in this, and at the level of of our surface reading, that the heart is pumping and the lungs are exchanging gas, and we take it a step further in to the mitochondria within the cell, and we discover a whole nother series of activities going on that even take us beyond our normal way of thinking to almost to the level of what I would have called growing up science fiction, the concept of teleporting, the the, the quantum level that we're brought to is fascinating, and it does not reject the presence of spirit. In fact, it reinforces that something microscopic, something beyond our ability to perceive, is guiding our entire progress. These are the references that support the claims that I'm making related to the previous slides. So here we get to another, I don't want to say confession as much as a mistake. Here I thought I was making an approach to Tiphareth based on the central diagram here that I borrowed from Warren Kenton. And in some ways, that is true. But what I've came to discover over time, and I must admit at times I was frustrated as to how long does this arriving in Tiphareth take? Sure, one has little, how would I call it, moments of light and feelings of grace and wonderment, but I'm still circumambulating Tiphareth, thanks to the grace of God. Where we see marked in red on the right side of the middle diagram, this word soul triad is represented by the letter Taith, which unites Hesed and Geburah, and they are also linked to Tiphareth. These are difficult to see on this particular slide because this is a slide where it shows the names Seraphim, which have to do with Geburah, Kashmalim, which have to do with Hesed, and Tiphareth here is marked both as Malachim and Sandalphon. And that's the triad that we're focusing on. So it's just easier to say the soul triad. And what I wanted to point out was is it is tied into the kundalini and what is referred to as a serpent force. Warren Kenton, that is, says in his Anatomy of Fate that the soul triad is the place where inner alchemy of the psychological metabolism occurs. And in many ways, we're dealing with inner alchemy and metabolism in his presentation. So I just wanted to quote him there. And it's significant to point out that he emphasizes that it occurs within this soul triad. I don't want to say that I'm even there yet. I just said I'm circumambulating Tiphareth, and that is if I'm lucky. But it's important that we have a sense of what is above, or in circumambulating, I would emphasize what is deeper within. Um, as we move closer to unveiling deeper aspects of our own inner being. The soul is the receptacle of the psychological self consciousness. And I mentioned it a few times, I think in every one of the presentations, but it behooves me to repeat it again that where when we're circumambulating this Tiphareth, there's three levels of simultaneous influence. The difficulty is that we're unconscious of these inner influences. The first interaction, I'll start off by closer to the circumference, closer to the outer reality, is the world of action, which is what we encounter daily at a superficial level, and then the world of formation, which represent more of an allegorical way of looking at things. As we move deeper within, we then become aware of action, formation, and creation. In this case, creation will be those unexplainable God made coincidences, so to speak. At the level of formation and creation, we're mostly unaware. As we go deeper within ourselves, I thought it would be best to, or it was suggested that this pentagram or five-pointed star be brought up again, at least briefly. And I would just point out that the ascending point represents spirit's dominion over the subtle vehicles of personality. More on the subtle vehicles will be expressed in a little bit. And what's important here is that emphasizing that it would be best to see it in the middle little diagram, that every line of a pentagram is divided into three segments. Of, in this particular case, I've used the numbers 8, 5, and 8. The middle segment equals the same proportional relationship to the others. It makes sense since the other two are 8. Extreme and mean proportion are equal to the Pythagorean golden section phi. It suggests that the lesser part is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. In essence, 5 is to 8, as 8 is to 13, which is the addition of 5 plus 8, and 13 is to 21, the whole line. So that in each one of these proportions, we have 1.6. We'll keep it at that. And that is our golden ratio. Now, what's interesting is connecting the line of the pentagram with every single line of the pentagram divided by the other lines is equal to the golden ratio. As we can see if we carefully look to the star, that each line is divided into 3, and the three segments are equal in each case, so that makes perfect sense. What's even more interesting is that as we look in the pentagram, well, if we look carefully at the border, the dotted lines, we'll see a pentagon. And from that pentagon, we see our pentagram. And when we look within the pentagram, we see an inverted pentagon. And this goes on forever. This is referred to as an infinite recursion. And it's good to keep in mind. We'll expand on it as time goes on. But this recursive geometry was an indication to the Pythagoreans that the body was grown out of this self-reflexivity. And then we just discussed the pentagram. Maybe it makes sense to look at Gebura, our fifth sephira, moving downwards or more towards the external reality. And what I wanted to point out here, since we're focusing on readings, is that Pekad has three names associated with it, or Gebura has three names associated with it, which it doesn't matter really. Pekad, Gebura, and Din. Fear, strength, and justice. And I wanted to use Ezekiel's vision to give us examples of the three variations. We'll focus only today on the first two. The third will come later. And when Ezekiel first witnessed the infinite breaking into the finite world, the flashing fire, the roaring winds, the monstrous many-eyed wheels, experienced psychological terror, warns about spiritual peril, ultimate ego dissolution. So the quote in Ezekiel 1:4, as the color of amber out of the midst of the fire. He was looking from the outside, from the material world, at surface appearances of the universe, which signifies separate consciousness. The electric energy as described here, the kashmal, is within the physical matter, waiting to be distilled. Ezekiel 1:27, appearance of his waist, loins in Hebrew, and upward, I saw as it were the color of amber, with the appearance of fire all around it. And then he looks from the waist downward and describes a similar thing. What we're seeing here is that part of the divine is fragmented, but he's starting to experience it as the divine, as a divine anthropos. Still, in these first two readings, we're at the level of pachad. The divine vision overwhelms him, the fear of the Lord. He falls flat on his face. By Ezekiel 8:2, from the appearance of his loins even downward, fire, and from his loins upward, as the appearance of brightness, as the color of amber. Here we pay close attention to the descriptions. We start to see that there is increased integration. Ezekiel's relation to the Kashmal depicts the evolution of consciousness. Moses raised the copper bronze serpent, elevating the raw fiery force of the left column. There we see the seraphim. Kashmalim has said mercy, expansion, as we see related to the card of the Wheel of Fortune, key 10. The seraphim, Gebura, severity, contraction, here are associated with key 16, the tower. Key 8 in the middle of these two, in a slightly larger reproduction, represents the alchemical transmutation in the mitochondrial electron transport system. I have to laugh a little bit. This is just there is relevance for my putting this in here, but it fascinates me. Kashmalim equals the scintillating electric ones, the current, uninhibited expanding flow of the electrons, dynamic, loving impulse of life to move, flow, and eliminate. The Gebura, seraphim, fire, iron, the resistance, fiery boundary and restraint. Gebura's iron centers. Hesed, electricity, which scatter chaotically as destructive lightning. Gebura channels that electricity into a disciplined, precise path. The mitochondrial electron transport system equals the Ouroboros, the tail devourer, depicted in snakes biting their tails. We see it around the waist of the magician in Key 1, or as a dragon devouring its tail to generate life. What I found very interesting is that the very word Ouroboros scientifically is also a metaphor for the mitochondria recycling and repairing itself. And here, right below, I give you the reference where you can find that. More interesting, when I was working in the lab at the university here in Germany, um, the device that we used to measure mitochondrial respiration was from a company in Austria, and it was called Ouroboros. In any event, Hesed, the Kashmalim, represents a continuous influx of hydrogen ions, protons across the membrane, creates an electrochemical gradient. Gebura, the seraphim, represent the mitochondrial cytochromes. They utilize iron and copper centers to temporarily bind and transfer the electrons, the burning ones, or fiery serpents. Ezekiel's vision of flashing amber, the Kashmal, and burning fire, seraphim, a man sitting on a throne, is Tiphareth. Kashmal, a speaking silence. In the Talmud, they represented as two opposing forces: Kash, silence, stillness, and Mal, speed, vibration. The four letters of Kashmal, paths on the left column of Gebura. When I saw that, I was fascinated. The Kashmal, which represent Hesed on the right column, through individual letters, as we can see here on the diagram. The Kate as key 7, the Chariot. Sheen is in two places. It's a very special letter in that regard. Not only is it the Holy Spirit, but it's found in the place, as we see here, of Gabriel, the central column, which would normally be considered the place of Da'at. But on the left column, it is also what joins Hod to Malkuth, here represented as the Beni Elohim and the cherubim, and we see it there in its placement. Mem links Beni Elohim in the seraphim, which is Hod and Gebura, and Lamed links the fifth Sephirah to the sixth Sephirah, Tiphareth, Gebura to Tiphareth. I was fascinated. In a way, that's literally what happens. The currents get bound around the metallic centers. So we'll leave it at that for the moment. Kate is the intelligence of the house of influence. Sheen is the perpetual intelligence. Mem is a stable intelligence. And Lamed, justice, is the faithful intelligence. And the Sefer Yetzirah tells us because by it, faith, the powers of the life breath, are caused to multiply. There's a lot here. I would spend some time letting this slide speak to you. Here we see 5 different renditions of the card of strength, Taith, who unites Hesed and Gebura. On the far left, from the Marseilles Tarot deck, the opening the lion's mouth. The left lower border from Crowley, I let that speak for itself. It's called Lust in this particular, the Crowley Thoth deck. On the far upper right, the White Rider deck, we see the woman closing the lion's mouth. And in Paul Foster Case Boda's deck, we see the opening of the lion's mouth. In the two on the right, we see the most parallels. Um, and at this point, I would just point out that in these two, we also see that the woman is bound to the lion through a wreath of roses. And it's interesting the positions of the tails of the lion and the two cards, the upper and the lower. I won't go into that. It's just mentioning it's enough. At the place of the loins of the lions, we see in yellow, in both cases, what appears to be a mountain that actually parallels the mountain that we see on the left of the card. Um, that's some kind of Masonic secret, which I'm not privy on. What is interesting to me with regard to it is that in both these cards on the right, we see the women with the lion, where they're opening or closing the mouth, um, out in a natural field. In Shirley and Peggy's transformational tarot, we see the field replaced by a forest of trees, of erect standing trees. And interestingly, it's from all the decks, except for maybe the Marseille, where the woman's feet are visible. Um, but what I really wanted to point out here is this tree. It seems to be covering the very region the, that when the whole latter half of the lion. Um, and the other thing I'll point out is that her hand is no longer on the mouth, but at the crown of the head, and the other hand extended out towards the forest. But it's an intriguing thing with this tree, um, in this, how would I call it, covering both the abdominal, lower abdominal, and sacral regions of this lion. Yeah, much to think about. Much of our evolution has led to a transformation from the horizontal animal plane to a vertical human plane. And as we look to that card, it would seem that the realigned physiology from animal to human involved a return to the vegetable phase, as we see in key 8 above here on the far right. A reversion from not only in the physical geometry, but in the process of our in and out breath. So the animal phase reverted to the vegetable phase to evolve into the human phase. The nefesh ha samachat, the vegetable soul. It anchors light, transforms volatile cosmic fire into the stable, breathing, living earth. Anchoring the spine into the sacrum created a stable vertical stem, conducting energy upward. The plant phase, the energy moves up the stem. In the human phase, the structural change, the sacral region, is equivalent to our raw, fiery animal magnetism. The lion force of key 8 integrated is equivalent to the tree, the sex center of the lion. The sympathetic system, the lion, the fight or flight, adrenaline, expansion, catabolic energies. The lion represents Mars, the raw, untamed animal of key 8. The parasympathetic system, the woman, rest and digest, lowers heart rate, constricts the pupils, and activates chyle in the intestines. Virgo, key 9. These are references supporting what was just stated. Chyle, the virgin's milk, associated with lacteals and thoracic duct. They're keys to physiological transmutation. They represent a crucifixion and passive surrender. Raising the cross is assault. Raising the cross daily. The lacteals, the lymphatic vessels, selectively absorb fats that are trapped sparks of the divine light, hidden within nature. The chyle is the milky white fluid, purified volatile salt of the earth. Alchemically, fat oil is the carrier of soul, the sulfur. The crucifixion in the thorax, the conjunction of ruach. The thoracic duct empties milky chyle into the venous bloodstream of the left subclavian vein and then enters the heart and lungs. Blood containing chyle breathes in ruach, noema, the Holy Spirit, the divine breath of life. The chyle is crucified, broken down in the fiery oxygenated furnace, the mitochondrial ETS. The thorax is the realm of Tiphareth, the heart, the cross of the cardiorespiratory system. Note the placement of the lion's head in relation to the woman. The seemingly physical meets the metaphysical. Passive surrender and crucifixion. Core psychological and physiological truth of the great work. The ego cannot force transmutation through willpower. Self-defense, anxiety, intellectual striving, the imposing will equals a sympathetic fight or flight. This leads to the lacteals constricting, digestion gets stopped up, and the chyle becomes toxic, heavy, and stagnant. The lymphatic system the assimilation of chyle, the parasympathetic nervous system. Rest and digest. Key 8. Deep rhythmic breathing. The deep diaphragmatic breathing stimulates the vagus nerve, which signals the hypothalamus to release oxytocin. Endogenous H2S, hydrogen sulfide, a crucial neurotransmitter, regulates rhythm, depth, and pacing of respiration. These are the scientific references supporting what was just stated. Here we have a quote from Paul Case's The Book of Tokens on Key 8, Taith. And because the tally referreth to counting, and so too all the works of number. By this letter do I show, first, that all things are brought forth through number, and second, that all works of power accomplished by the wise have number for their foundation. For the circle of the tally is the coiled fiery power which cometh from the sun, and to rule this thou must learn to count. Count aright, and thou shalt have oil for thy lamps, for the oil for lighting containeth the secret of the letter Teth. This is the oil which rises like a serpent, the oil which thy father Jacob poured upon the stone in the house of strength. From the commentary on Teth in the Book of Tokens, we read, the lamps are the interior stars or chakras. The oil is the nerve force, kundalini. It is made to energize the lamps by means of exercises in which counting is essential because they include rhythmic breathing. The key of the cosmos and numbers. This is from the Tarot, a key to the wisdom of the ages. It's a fascinating diagram. This, ironically enough, is the first book, the Tarot, that I picked up from Paul Foster Case. The story of how I came across the book is wonderful, and unfortunately, though entertaining, too long for this presentation to include here. I have included in something I'm writing, an autobiographical work that I'm writing, but it's a wonderful story. I came across it in a antiquariat, an antique store. In any event, I've danced with this symbol for a very, very long time before it really started speaking to me. Although it probably had from the very beginning. I just was doing it subconsciously. I want to change our attention from that main symbol there to the little images of it reproduced on the right, where we see that following the little letters in the symbol, we can draw every number from 0 to 10, 10 being, of course, the 0 and the 1 combined together, as we see at the bottom right of the picture. But that we can actually draw each of the numbers visible here following patterns that are in this image. Um, I found fascinating, and I won't say more. I, there's so much that surfaces as we dance with these geometric symbols that I don't want to spoil the fun of self-discovery. This is a quotation from Moshe Cordovero's The Garden of Pomegranates that's relevant to our theme. From the mystery of the supernal number, Sfar, the supernal mother, number refers to counting things, as it is said in after the numbering wherewith David his father had numbered them. So with understanding, the letters of the book are particularized, for the subtle things in wisdom come out and are actualized through understanding. The relation of wisdom to understanding is that of the male to the female, as the relationship of kingdom to beauty. Just as the female actualizes the potential of the male, so too understanding actualizes the particulars of wisdom. The numbers show how things are particularized one by one. Therefore, she is called Supernal Mother, for she is the mother of all things coming out of wisdom, the Father. Sfar, Samek, Pe, and Resh are also, with different pronunciations, referred to as Sefer, book, Safar, barber, and Safar, the counted. The word itself means border, frontier, boundary, limit, things to contemplate with regard to the Great Mother, understanding. The involution of spirit, the downward or outward compression of spirit, represents our mineral phase. Spirit manifesting as matter. Evolution is matter awakening back to its source, spirit, its origins. The inward expansion of spirit in increasingly complex forms is equivalent to the evolution of consciousness. In Cabala and Exodus by Warren Kenton, Chev Ben Shimon Halavi, that was the very first book. I've read all his books by now, but that was the very first book that I encountered from Warren, ironically enough, at the C.E. Young Institute's library many years ago, over 20 years ago. What I want to share that was significant from that book was that Warren tells us that the soul, remembering its divine origins, is what the Exodus is all about. On the far right, I have one of Warren Kenton's Exodus 13, the figure 13 from from Kabbalah and Exodus. And I just briefly want to mention that the blank circles in the lower face of action, the mineral vegetable region, represent pre-human, pre-organic states. These circles end up being filled out as we manifest spirit through transparency. And that the biological terms that he uses in the cosmic diagrams hint at precipitation of spirit into matter, and more on that needs not be said at the moment. Here we see again the key of the cosmos in numbers, and I've bothered to color in a few of the circles to show some designs. We won't talk about the yellow egg, but as we can see in light blue, labeled on the left, Atzilith, the world of the divine. In a darker blue, the world of creation. In purple, the world of formation. And in red, the world of action. I will keep those colors for the rest of our presentation to make it somehow easier to pay attention to what world or interacting faces we're looking at. On the far right, what you see is I've basically just deleted our background key of the cosmos and numbers, and I'm showing that these four interlacing worlds or circles that represent the worlds, Azilut, Beria, Jazira, Asiya, actually are a construction diagram for a tree of life, which we see Kether in the light blue little circle in the middle by the 1, and the little dots by 2, 3, 4, 5 um, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 represent these points of intersection, which is worthy of note, the places where the sephiras, or the points, are manifested in the one tree. And here I just wanted to show that the involution of spirit is associated with the circles um, in a descending arc. The evolution, of course, would be on the right side of the ascending arc, but we won't get into that. I just wanted to give you some visuals on this. As I said, I've danced with this for a very, very long time, and uh, contemplation on it is, how would I phrase it, pays off. So I mentioned already that Exodus seems to be about instructions for the spirit, and I'm pretty sure that all of us today, especially those who are paying attention to this, are aware that there is no clear connection to any historical or archaeological evidence of our Exodus tradition, as pointed out by the biblical scholar and archaeologist Dr. Mary Joan Winleith, who I've cited earlier for other very, she's a very, very talented uh, scientist and biblical scholar. Scholars tend to suggest that Exodus is a foundational national myth, which relates to the earlier quote from Tolkien that I cited early or in one of the slides. Exoterically, Exodus is an allegory or spiritual roadmap for the soul. I'm quoting Warren Kendon on that. And as we just talked about involution and evolution, I wanted to point out again that involution is spirit slows its vibratory rate, condensing into unconscious matter. And evolution is matter waking up, a reflexive eigenform, recognizing itself as spirit. This is from an insight derived from Reflexivity and Eigenform by Louis H. Kaufman, uh, mathematician and cybernetics expert. Here is another mistake that I had committed in my Kabbalistic studies. I was very much, and it's a mistake that pretty much tied into the level of consciousness I had at the time, where I was pretty much working on a linear, um, a, a series of linear paths. I have to laugh because it's linear, where, but yet represented by a bunch of circles. And but earlier I was focused on these linear trajectories, these linear paths and triangles, and as you may be aware from what I've been discussing, and it was not apparent to me that, except through the constant circumambulating that I've been doing around Tiphareth, that it finally dawned on me that um, it's important to integrate both the linear and the circular trajectories in trying to approach the hidden center of our beings. Let me start off with this quote from Exodus 15:20. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. I pause for a moment because I sense it, I hear it. Oh, what a wonderful moment. Miriam equals fluid, rhythmic, unifying remedy to the linear world of separation. The fluid, rhythmic, unifying remedy to the linear world of separation. The circle dance softens the harsh, sharp, linear judgment. Reminds me of the missing piece meeting the big O. It is a protective womb of cyclical time, seasons, moon cycles, heartbeats, respiratory rhythms. Macho, a round dance from the root kol, to whirl, to twist or writhe. The circle dance equals cosmic symbol of victory, joy, and the resetting of creation. Jesus' circle dance was right after the Last Supper, before he was arrested and crucified. The apostles held hands after that last evening, their Last Supper. They held hands in a circle, Jesus, its center, singing a mystical hymn, and they quoted, Amen. It's a celebratory dance, a dance of spiritual liberation of humanity, awakening and awakening in the coffins of death. The spiral movement of the psyche slowly detaches from purely material action, Yetzirah. The energy stops moving in straight lines. It begins to curve, to circumambulate around the central pillar. The spiral movement allows the psyche to see through cause and effect. It begins imagining instead of merely fantasizing and reacting. Circumambulating Tiphareth, one becomes aware that there are 5 deeper Sephiroths transmuting consciousness from within. Our constitution and simplicity will determine if the veil, the Parocheth, is translucent or divisive and split, leading to a psychotic breakdown. The 19th path leads to a horizontal tension that tears most seekers apart. The polarities, they must be held in balance. Hesed, mercy, expansion, infinite love. Gebura, judgment, severity, strict limits. The illusion of choice is resolved in the spiral dance. The soul triad is the heart of the psyche. Hesed and Gebura are cosmic powers. We must follow a reciprocating spiral path to link the two cosmic powers. Note, Lamed key 11 links the 5th and 6th circles. Yod key 9 links the 4th and 6th circles. Taith key 8 links the 4th and 5th circles. But there are three additional paths from deep within: the ground in Malkuth of creation and the Tiphareth of formation. Zayin, the lovers, key 6. He, the emperor, key 4. And Gimel, the high priestess, key 2. The balance of Hesed and Geburah must be completed before Tiphareth is safe to enter. Tiphareth equals our cosmic stage, where the lower self meets the higher self. It's a hall of mirrors, requiring intense self-reflection. This initiation aligns your personal will with a higher cosmic will. Circumambulation unites Hesed and Geburah. It is a spiral circularity where force becomes form, active volition is transformed to radical receptivity. The veil of Paroketh, the spiritual psychological curtain blocking Tiphareth. Paroketh itself is spelled with a Pei, a Resh, a Kav, a Tav. It equals the 4 elements of the human body, all in the trunk of the body. Pei is the letter of Mars, Resh, the letter of the sun, Kaf, the letter of Jupiter, and Tav equals Saturn. As divine cosmic principles descend, externalize into human vehicles, the polarities invert. It's the law of reflection across the veil. Inverted personality vehicles must be worked through reflections. It's a very old diagram. It's a diagram of the human constitution in a geometric circular pattern. Another perspective to the tree of life. Here we see Yakida in Kether at the central point of our concentric circles. It's the innermost principle of man, Yakida, the indivisible. The thread soul of Adam, our Kav, which I think I've mentioned in every single presentation, which helps me remember regardless what's going on, that I'm always connected. Here is the radius of the system of circles. The 10 concentric circles represent a macrocosm. Within 9 concentric circles equals our inner constitution. They're osculating, kissing. These 2 cosmic thresholds, the ninefold nature of man, which is equivalent to the 9 angelic choirs, create a living chain from the divine core to the edge of manifestation, where the four elements are woven together. The seven small circles within the nine concentric circles of the human constitution represent the subtle bodies, the vehicles of the self, utilized to navigate the four worlds. Kia, the life force, associated with Hokmah. It is externally tangent to the innermost sphere, Kether, and internally tangent to the outermost boundary, Malkuth. Note that in this intersection there is a small circle labeled Kia. Circumference connects Kether and Binah of this small little circle interiorly, exteriorly to the four elements, Guf, the body, and the physical senses. Hesed, memory, and Gebura, will, cosmic powers, do not have subtle bodies represented. As cosmic powers, they create the polarity that shapes all destiny. When we look carefully at the diagram, we'll see that as they externalize, memory is related to intellect, the subtle mental body, and will is related to desire, the subtle desire body. It pays to spend time looking at the relationships established in these concentric circles within one another, especially in complementing our Jacob's ladder. I wanted to emphasize again how significant and important to be able to distinguish the energies of the three worlds at their meeting. So in Asiya, the physical realm, the junction where the three worlds meet is Kether of action. As was pointed out earlier, to reach this place, there has to be transformed physiology through meditation, prayer, breath work, because the vibratory rate increases in formation and creation, and the vehicles must be developed to be able to handle this increased vibratory rates. In Jitsira, the world of formation, which is Tiphareth, there is great danger of ego inflation, which leads to destruction. The ego must surrender its solar sword and transmute into passive, receptive cup, which holds the blood. In the world of creation, the soul awakens to spirit through death and crucifixion that occurred in the world of formation at Tiphareth. The first heaven, the Adamah, is equivalent to the Black Madonna. There's polar tension at Tiphareth, the mediating intelligence and seat of the imaginative power. Thus, it requires a guide to navigate its imaginative currents. Olam ha-dimion can lead to the Mundus Imaginalis, or the world of illusion. The Mundus Imaginalis is looking up from Tiphareth to the Yesod of creation. It's a spiritual faculty of imagination, translating divine emanations into comprehensible symbols. Olam ha-dimion can be the world of illusions. As we cast our look downward, the Yesod of formation, the unrectified ego mind generating illusion, mistaking subjective, sublunary projections for reality. The alchemical intersection of the three lower worlds meet: Kether of action, Tiphareth of formation, Malkuth of creation, is the biblical dust of the ground from which Adam was formed. The Chaldean oracles tell us, stoop not down into the darkly splendid world wherein continually lieth a faithless depth, and Hades wrapped in gloom, delighting in unintelligible images. Stoop not down unto the darkly splendid world, wherein continually lieth a faithless depth, and Hades wrapped in gloom, delighting in unintelligible images. Descent does not equal our origins. It's actually equivalent to an elemental swamp beneath human consciousness. Placing vitriol down in lower Jitsira Asiya is very, very dangerous. The soul rectification represented by vitriol is best in the Kether, Tiphareth, Malkuth, three-world intersection, where the dust of the ground, afar min ha Adamah, where Adam was formed. The Black Madonna equals our earthly reflection of Binah, the Heavenly Mother. The following is a quote from Sabine Spielrein, a brilliant psychoanalyst. The dark problem, there is no time, no place, no opposites. Above and below do not exist. It is undifferentiated, potentially creative, and hence an eternal living entity. The dust of the ground equals the prima materia. Here is another mistake that has haunted me a long time. The Great Mother for centuries Cultural histories have spoken of the suppression of the feminine and heralded her return through emerging symbols of the goddess, like this below, by green. The fact that a certain group of these cathedrals appears on the map to imitate the constellation of Virgo was taken as an early representation of the Virgin's heavenly powers. I've spoken about this in a previous presentation. The Shekhinah as a distinct feminine persona originates from the 12th and 13th century. Prior to that, Shekhinah was not feminine. And green tells us that it happened at a time parallel to the Marian devotion in Western Christian Europe. In Virgin Mary, in the Song of Songs, reflections on a Kabbalistic symbol and its historical context, as cited there below, one can find it. It was a very revealing and acute appreciation of the historical apparent evolution of the feminine consciousness. He goes on to point out Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a medieval saint and writer and was very devoted to the Virgin Mary. We won't go into it, it's not relevant in the moment. But in the Song of Songs, Green sees parallels between Bernard of Clairvaux and the Kabbalists, and especially parallels between the bride, the Virgin Mary, the Tiphareth Malkuth intersection, and the Shekhinah. And he successfully illustrates how both faiths were experiencing a simultaneous psychological and cultural shift, he argues, a profound yearning to integrate the divine feminine. And we'll leave it there for the moment. What I want to emphasize here is, again, this, even what I've stated here, the unification of the Great Mother, is also a mistake on my part. But this is what I had written, and we'll keep it there. The unification of the Great Mother beyond the gender split. And the correction of this mistake is in my emphasizing that the split that I perceived in the Great Mother was in my own consciousness. The Great Mother was always whole, remains whole. It was in my perception and in my limited consciousness that led to a mistaken belief, to a mistaken limitation of the Great Mother. Nature is not merely the female half of a binary pair. Nature is the all-inclusive matrix. Nature is unity. The Empress in Key 3 is pregnant with all possibilities: seed and soil, active force and receptive form. What is returning is subconscious, fluid vitality. The Great Mother is and holds both the masculine, active, piercing, solar fire, the feminine, the receptive, fluid matrix, the cup and the womb. The resurgence of the feminine versus the wholeness of nature. Circumambulation is a spiral circularity, a rhythmic balancing. Consciousness is safely drawn, Jitsira, into Bria, helped bypass this very real yet superficial political duality. The Great Mother is nature, Binah. She, Mary, is the human vessel through whom God is born into the world. the human vessel through whom God is born into the world. Wolfson, and through a speculum that shines, the feminine potency equals is equivalent to giving form to that which emerges from her, a stamp that imprints the material surface with a particular form. Specifically, these forms consist of the four angelic beasts beheld by Ezekiel. The Shekhinah, the feminine potency of the divine, is equivalent to the imaginative faculty within the soul. The Shekhinah is our locus of revelatory experience. The Mundus Imaginalis is the abstract spiritual truths of creation translated to the visionary forms and shapes of formation. The imagination is the divine element of the soul. It enables one to gain access to the realm of incorporeality. Again, citing Wolfson, through a speculum that shines. Yesod is a gradation that unifies the feminine and the masculine potency of God. Wolfson, through a speculum that shines. It's an anatomical bridge where the male and female dualities are radically collapsed. The transition between Yesod and Dot bridges the lower worlds to the ultimate divine. Bridges the lower worlds to the ultimate divine. The paradox equals the coincidence of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorium. The deceptive veil, the ancestral traumas, the shells of the dead, are equivalent or the equal exile and concealment. The radical oneness, ein od milvado, nothing outside of the divine essence. Nothing outside of the divine essence. The dark, deceptive shell is itself made of the exact same light as the highest angel. The images are the visual elements that parallel 7 audible voices of revelation. This is Wolfson, through a speculum that shines, quoting Eleazar of Worms. The idem yud are not purely mental constructs, but are ontic entities, angels that manifest the divine will to the human imagination. The angel is thus the subtle substance that assumes various forms in accordance with the individual's capacity as well as a divine decree at the given moment. The next few quotes are all from Elliot Wolfson's Through a Speculum That Shines. The contemplative gazing results in the production of each angelic form, specularized through the image of the Shekhinah. Through the agency of the imagination, one enters the Mundus Imaginalis, which is not the imaginary world of subjective fantasy or psychotic hallucination, lunacy, but is instead a realm where invisible realities become visible and corporal entities are spiritualized. Ezekiel's vision of the Merkaba, with its wheel within wheels, eyes and fire, is the quintessential biblical example of a human entering the Mundus Imaginalis. These next quotes are from Henry Corbin, Swedenborg, and Esoteric Islam. Interiorization reveals the spiritual reality that envelopes, surrounds, contains the reality called material. Interiorization, in other words, going within, reveals the spiritual reality that envelopes, surrounds, contains the reality called material. One must turn that over a few times. It turns out the reality, previously internal and hidden, is revealed to be enveloping, surrounding, containing the external and visible. The reality the senses report are completely contained within the womb of your awareness. You have never experienced anything outside of your own consciousness. The Shekhinah, the Virgin Mary, as Theotokos, Mother of God, is the very womb of space. She is nature herself. She is not an external goddess. She is the living matrix of consciousness. She allows the formless light, looks of God, to take the form represented by the senses. The intelligence of unity, Akaduth, is related to Gimel, the high priestess. On the far left, we have the construction circles that form the tree of life. And in red, I've highlighted the path of Gimel, which is there depicted by its format. Gimel, I have to laugh because I recognize it's also an isosceles triangle here. But what is beautiful is that as we can see from the 1 to the 6, which is the path of Gimel, the 13th path. When we look to the image on the right, where we see a different representation of the four worlds depicted on one tree of life, we see that a little gray dot, which would represent on this particular tree, Da'ath, the place where Gabriel is, so I have him on the outside. But there's a blue line leading from Kether to Tiphareth. And that is the path of Gimel on a single tree of life. When we go back to the left, we'll see that that blue, darker blue circle between 1 and 6 represents the entire, or the diameter of the entire world of creation. Even more interesting, is that that world of creation unites all four worlds, because in the place of Tiphareth, or the kingdom of creation, or the crown of Asiya, the place where the three lower worlds meet, where the sixth is. We've united the three lower worlds. Already at the place of Dath, we unite the world of emanation. What I also would like to point out, or what should be pointed out, is that the 13th path, and it's better seen in the image on the right, crosses two reciprocating paths. The path of Taith, where we spent most of this presentation discussing, and the path of Daleth further up, uniting Chokmah and Binah, which represents our third psychic knot that we haven't even mentioned yet. So the intelligence of unity, Akaduth, interestingly is grammatically feminine. What I found most fascinating is that the very word Akaduth, by gematria, is equal to 419. 419 is the value of the letter Taith, spelled out Taith, Yod, Tav. Unity, togetherness, unification. And with this, I bring this to closure. On the left, the key of the cosmos and numbers. On the right, from the Song of Songs by Marvin H. Pope. This image is literally written with a text of the Song of Songs, arranged in a floral design for a wedding. It's the frontispiece for Marvin Pope's Song of Songs. Blessings.